We are no less than the Paris Commune workers. They resisted for 70 days, and we are still going on for a year and a half. Those are words written by the Syrian anarchist Omar Aziz in 2012, whose martyrdom will be marked on February 16 in events happening across the world in memory of a man whose ideas were inspirational for the Syrian revolution and who remains still to this day not known enough, specifically in leftist circles, as a contemporary anarchist thinker, a revolutionary thinker, and a martyr for the cause of the Syrian revolution. I started this podcast episode by reading that quote by him, and it's honestly an incredibly powerful quote. For one, because the successes of the Syrian revolution in those early days is something that, or rather the forms of organizing it took, and the kind of real concrete example of community level organizing and resisting the state is something that's completely ignored by the left writ large. Syria and its discourses are limited completely to geopolitics, limited completely in relation to the state of Israel and Western imperialism. But what the Syrians did, specifically with the local councils, some of the most important and impressive and inspirational forms of anarchist organizing in our lifetimes, in at least a few generations. And I am very glad that his martyrdom will be marked this year in a week. And so I'm going to talk today about Omar Aziz, about anarchism in the Arab world, and about Remember Omar Aziz, the events that are going to take place on February 16. Before I do that, I have one very cool announcement. I've been doing live streams these days. I've noticed that it's a thing that it's there, I can do, I feel comfortable doing, and it's nice, I kind of enjoy it. I've done a few so far, and what I'm planning on doing is basically when I release this episode, I will do a live stream the following day to talk about this episode, to field any questions, to share more thoughts or anything that I missed and didn't talk about in the episode, but also to wait for you listening to be able to engage, or, if there's anything that I say in this episode that you want to know more about, or you disagree with, or you want further elaboration, that's the space to do it. I'll probably do it for like an hour, 2-hour live stream. It'll be on YouTube. Anyone who's on YouTube, you can just access it very easily. There's no you don't have to be a member or anything, I think most people have like Google accounts and whatever. Anyway, so that's the announcement, and stay tuned. If you want notifications about those live streams, follow me on Blue Sky at Ayman Makarim or Ayman Mac, and on Instagram, Politically Depressed. And I usually give notifications there, or subscribe on YouTube, the From the Periphery YouTube, and you'll get notifications when I've sort of planned to go live. I announce it usually a few hours before, so that's the announcement. Today's headlines: Lebanon, after 2 years of complete political deadlock, now has a government. Nawaf Salim is our new prime minister. And the government he has formed is interesting. It's definitely something new. There's a lot of breaks with the past, especially in the last 17 years. It's the first time that the so-called Shia duo, that is Hezbollah and Harakat Amal, don't have a veto power. But also it's seen like the return of the Lebanese forces. Um, and functionally, it's just a kind of technocratic government. I'm not all too excited. People have been asking me about my takes, and I have a very boring take, which is I think we are in such a shit show. The collapse in Lebanon is so extreme and so radical, and the class warfare is such an intense point that I don't think what we need is just a sort of sane state. And that's basically what it is. He's named the government, um, the reform and rescue. And I've heard this before. Rescue governments are a big thing in the Arab world. And it's all about statecraft. It's all about whatever. But I think, sorry, I'm going to still try to develop a more proper analysis. But I think looking at it from a class perspective, I don't really care. I have very few hopes for this or that government. And yeah, like the emboldening of Western imperialism in our region. The American ambassador came and she was treated like royalty. And from our soil, she thanked Israel. Like, it's just bizarre. It's bonkers. But you know what I mean? Like, this sort of necessitates a more, I don't know, antagonistic approach. But I understand because we can't antagonize the US because then, I mean, we can, and many of us are, but the main goal of this government is essentially to straighten things up, to kind of salvage what can be salvaged of the state, and essentially then, I guess, apply for IMF grants or US grants or whatever, World Bank, which is gonna keep the like economy afloat, but it's gonna be a disaster for the rest of us. There basically is no, there's a need for a radical break, but there's no real ability for it, and this does not present itself to me at all as like a genuine break. It may be a break from certain political dynamics, but whatever. I am still developing a proper analysis, and when I find it or discover it, I'll share that with you. But yes, Lebanon now has a president and a prime minister. People are hopeful. I'm very, very cynical. So I'm not very interesting. What else happened? So it's really funny. A few hours after I published my last episode, where I did talk about Trump, I talked about Gaza, Trump made his now infamous remarks with Netanyahu that, yeah, they want to ethnically cleanse Gaza and rebuild it, but like essentially push out all the Palestinians into Egypt, and described it hell on earth in a very absurd thing wherein the hell raiser, the hell maker, was sitting right next to him. But the way they describe it is Gaza is almost like ontologically hell. It will constantly bring in destruction, as opposed to it is Israel that is doing the destruction. It is Netanyahu himself, whatever. But so there's been a lot of uproar. The Arab regimes have all given their responses of like, no, we stand with the Palestinians, where it's like, my ass you do. But yeah, also a lot of European states who had been very happily supporting the US and Israel commit genocide. But as long as they're committing genocide and saying, we want peace, we want a two-state solution, they were fine with doing it. But now it's they're doing genocide and they're saying they're doing genocide. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, this is a bonkers hypocrisy to me, and I don't understand it. Like, what do you think was the plan? Like, this was Biden's plan. I think Blinken even literally proposed to Egypt they take in Palestinians from Gaza. But the fanatic support they've been receiving from the US, or that the US has been giving. And like, what is Israel's plan? Again, because like, they bring up the two-state solution, and it's ridiculous because it is impossible, and the Israelis are just fully openly saying, we do not want it, we are working against it, it is no longer possible. How many maps does Netanyahu have to show where it's like all of Greater Israel, like all of historic Palestine, for them to get it? And so it's this bizarre kind of hypocrisy, and I find it very frustrating that all of a sudden now, because it's Trump saying it, But it's not just Trump saying it, but he's saying the thing out loud, you know? I hate it. It's really frustrating. To me, it exposes a lot of things. It exposes, you know what I mean? Like Germany talking about the two-state solution, talking about peace or whatever. I mean, these are all bullshit kind of rhetorical like tools, because the two-state solution doesn't exist and has never existed, and it literally is just a kind of phrase to indicate that you have a kind of, what's a good word, like a solution. You know what I mean? And it's not a solution because it never addresses the problem, which is Zionism, which is Western imperialism, which is genocide, and Israeli expansionism. Like, I don't know, all these regimes, all these governments, all these states have just not kept up. And it's very frustrating. And a lot of people on the left or on pro-Palestine or whatever, like, there's just a very, I don't know, there's so much to fucking, I don't know, what I find frustrating is how much energy is then spent against Trump's comments, as though, like, the comment is more atrocious, or the statement that we want to resettle Gaza is more atrocious to some of these people. Here I mean specifically kind of whatever, like states, liberal governments, whatever, liberals as a whole, that stating outright the desire to cleanse Gaza is more atrocious to them than the actual act of cleansing, the actual genocide, which was what the Israelis were doing for months and are still doing. And now basically the genocide has become a structure. Like, even if the Israeli soldiers leave, like, people, all their homes are destroyed. People are dying of very basic illnesses. People are dying of the cold, of hunger. Like, none of these things have really gone away. Things have gotten cheaper in Gaza. There are no more bombs outright. People are still dying by like unexploded munitions. Yeah. But essentially, the genocide goes on because the genocide did not start on October 7th. The genocide of Palestinians, like, kind of is inseparable from the entire project of Zionism in Palestine, pushing them out, keeping them out, and slowly, you know, whittling away their ability to remain on the land. A lot of the land in Gaza is now, like, unfarmable. I don't know if people remember, like a year ago, the Israelis were talking about flooding the tunnels with salt water, with seawater. And, you know, I haven't seen anything specific about this, but they did it. I remember at the time they were talking about it, they did it. And that just makes so much land, like, what's the word? Like, unfarmable. And essentially they have destroyed the ability for people in Gaza to feed themselves, to produce food, to produce anything. And now they're completely dependent on aid. And yeah, it's so fucked up. And obviously I think Trump signals an escalation. Netanyahu is clearly very happy with Trump. But still, I think there is some continuity that I think people, it's just very strange to see people have this like sharp, wait, what? The US wants to do what? It's like they've been doing it. They've been doing it for 15, 16 months. And like the Israelis have been making the Gaza Strip uninhabitable. That's been part of the project of the siege for 18 years. Anyway, the last headline, like a bit unconventional, but is also going to be about the US, because there is straight up a coup happening in the US, and it all has to do with Elon Musk and Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency. And I don't know, I'm very curious to hear more from like sort of USian listeners. But like, what kind of resistance is there to this? I also read that like a lot of the resistance can't be filmed or shown or talked about, that people are doing things to just like block these kids from like entering the department of whatever. But so for those that don't know, essentially, a few months ago, before Trump won the election, Elon Musk, who had already been like drifting quite quickly to the far right, I think it's not unprecedented that like billionaires or like the high bourgeoisie essentially in times of crisis turn towards fascism. I think that's actually quite historical. With this rise of unionization, of discontent, of protests, and like a revolutionary whatever. But essentially, what Musk had invited Trump onto a Twitter call thing. It was a shit show. It kept crashing, but this was also just a few days after like the assassination attempt on Trump, and Elon Musk had like openly declared his support for and like endorsement for Trump. And in the call, I found this so bizarre. In the call, Musk like said like, yeah, there's a lot of waste. I was thinking, if you get whatever, I'd love to come in and clean house with you. And I think none of us thought too much of it, but it was very clearly that he was like pitching a job for himself. And that is what happened. And so for the last like 3 weeks, there's been a kind of blitzkrieg. And I think that's actually a good term in the context of class warfare. There is a blitzkrieg of gutting like the federal government, gutting health departments, educational department, the labor ministry, or all these things. Sorry, the terms are just a bit different in the US than in like the rest of the fucking world. But yeah, it's been bizarre. But there are so many things that are like straight up to the benefit of people like Musk, to billionaires, to millionaires, to the bourgeoisie, and to the white, But white poors are obviously going to get fucked over with the cutting of like Medicare. But yes, so many people are just losing their jobs very quickly because they're just like, khalas, no more US aid. And yeah, the more I'm seeing, the more scoops, the more revelations of who these people are that Musk is sending into the Department of Health, into all these governmental departments, which also it's very funny. Some people talk about it as the deep state. This is the state. And like the Department of Health, the Department of Education, just gutting completely. And to me, this is a coup, This is the complete replacement of a kind of regime, of the state of the United States of America, whatever. Which, again, is that kind of thing of like, I'm not a massive fan of the state, but here we're seeing it being carved up and dissected by a fascist. And yeah, it's honestly one of the just strangest, but most like, fuck, it's actually happening. And there's really little people can do about it. Like some judges have been blocking certain things, but also increase in deportations and fears like in migrant communities and undocumented communities, and just all around it's been horrible. I only focus on that because there is just too much to talk about on like the coup aspect of things. Yeah, it's a lot. But I think good framing to call it a sort of a coup, a blitzkrieg within the class warfare of literally the richest man in the world. And it's happening at a national level, at a federal level in the US, but it has international implications for sure. Like now with the sort of tariffs bullshit, and if there's a tariff war, like this is going to affect prices across the world. And not just prices, like holy shit, like honestly, I think there's a very strange feeling right now where we all know there are numerous bubbles that are just about to pop. They've been just about to pop for a while, but they've been kind of salvaged and like saved and like prevented from popping. Yeah, like the tech bubble, the AI bubble. I don't know. But like the atrocious amounts of wealth, like it doesn't exist. I feel like I'm going on a ramble. I'm going to slow down and I'm going to jump into it and just start talking about the main topic of today's episode, which is Omar Aziz. So, not enough people, in my opinion, know about Omar Aziz. And here specifically, I'm talking about leftists, I'm talking about anarchists, I'm talking about people who are interested in our region. And I think that has a lot of reasons, and I'm going to get into it. But first, I want to talk about Omar Aziz, the man. Omar Aziz was a Syrian man who, up until 2011, lived in self-exile in Saudi. I think he had like 3 kids. He had lived there for years. And when the revolution broke out, he decided to go back to Syria. And over the course of the first few months, he began observing and making his own analysis about the situation. And his most important contribution, in my opinion, is the recognition that the revolution remains something that happens over there, as in on the streets, facing the bullets in protests and the like. Omar Aziz was an anarchist, and what that meant is that he saw revolution as something that needs to be integrated into everyday life. That in order for the revolution to really take hold, it can't just be something that we engage in like once a day, every other day, at a protest, but rather should influence the ways we live, the ways we engage with our society and our community, and ultimately with ourselves. And so he wrote 2 essays that he published in Arabic on Facebook. And in them, he describes this sort of necessity to reconceptualize revolution, the Syrian revolution specifically, and bring it, essentially into every day. He describes this thing which, it's not his invention, but the idea of revolutionary time, as a way of separating from the authorities' time. And basically, what he was coming up with, or what he described, which already existed, and I'll get into this in a bit, but is this idea of local councils, local communities, organizations that happen at a neighborhood level, of neighbors, of fellow revolutionaries who take care of each other, practice mutual aid, provide necessary resources for people, document the crimes of the regime, but also organize within themselves on a non-hierarchical basis, organize in such a way that reflects the demands of the revolution. To sort of quote David Graeber, to live as though you're already free. I don't know if that is Graeber, but I hope I didn't misattribute that quote. And he himself, Aziz, founded, I believe, 4 such councils, and in Damascus and in the peripheries of Damascus, I believe. And this idea spread across the country, and I'll definitely link things in the show notes, more resources to read about these councils, to read about Omar Aziz. I, for my own part, was so incredibly inspired by this when I discovered Omar Aziz and the local councils and what they did, that I created a comic a few years ago on the Syrian Revolution and on the councils, and that's obviously going to be in the show notes. But essentially, these councils spread across the country and became not only a way for the revolution to manifest in daily interactions, but also was a way, because quite quickly, if we set ourselves back a little bit, almost instantly, within a few months of these protests, the regime started firing at protesters. Protests ceased to be spaces that people, they would still engage in them, but it was incredibly risky. And very quickly, the revolution became militarized, and I think already within a year or 2, certain areas were completely besieged by the regime, then by the regime and Hezbollah, then by Iran, and eventually also Russia in 2015, because the regime was falling and was collapsing. Anyway, these councils were essential to surviving siege. These councils were, again, not just a place of democratic organizing, it was the very first place where democratic elections were held in Syria for in 50 years, which is incredible. But it was also the mutual aid they were performing kept communities alive, kept them struggling and resisting literal siege. And some of these sieges went on for years. And yeah, keeping bakeries open, underground hospitals, keeping electricity, water flowing, medical care. These are really important things in sustaining a revolutionary movement and in resisting a bloodthirsty state that will stop at nothing to destroy this revolution. Again, and this is really important, and this is something that Western leftists refuse to reckon with. Refuse. 2011 saw the start of a revolution, and also saw the start of a counter-revolution. And Assad and all of these forces were part of the counter-revolution. They were the counter-revolution. And the slogan that they had was Assad or we'll burn the country. And that is what they did. And yeah, and through it all, especially in 2015 onwards, the narrative of the war on terror just really took hold. And this was Assad's narrative. These are terrorists, these are outside forces they want to overthrow for regime change. And functionally what happened is that Syrians were completely erased in the discourse. The Syrian revolution was completely erased in the discourse. You constantly hear about the Syrian civil war, about, regime change, but you don't hear about the revolution, which, as we've seen, very much still exists in spirit, with the fall of Assad, which again, we are in a very different situation. I'm talking 10 years has passed. And it's not that original revolutionary movement that overthrew Assad, but the fact that the regime collapsed so quickly, that all these soldiers, all these police officers, all these state administrators just kind of abandoned their posts a few months ago, is because no one believed in this regime. It had completely betrayed every single principle of being, you know what I mean? They killed and displaced half the country. Anyway, to me, the kind of autonomous rising up of the south in Syria that happened a few months ago, this is separate from HTS in the north. This is not just a remnant, but a continuation of that revolutionary spirit that started in 2011. Anyway, back to Omar Aziz. I really think re-examining, honestly, I think there needs to be a reckoning with how much bullshit, how much violence existed in the discourse amongst Western leftists when it came to Syria. And with the fall of Assad, with the confirmation of the dungeons of Saidnaya, of the torture methods, of the mass graves that we're finding, of interviewing people in Daraa and being like, we were gassed. There needs to be a reckoning for all of these Western leftists. Honestly, this is a hill I will die on. It is so frustrating, the obfuscation. We are not pawns. We're not part of some big game. We are people in this region, in our communities, who are trying to figure this shit out, who are struggling, who are coming up with ideas. And again, it really frustrates me that a lot of people do still talk about the Paris Commune and are trying to figure out what happened there. And meanwhile, at the same breath, at the same moment, there are anarchists organizing and attempting to resist state violence and an extermination that are completely being ignored. That's so frustrating. Anyway, so I went off a bit there, but I want to return to Omar Aziz himself, because Omar Aziz is not just an example of an exemplary anarchist thinker, Arab anarchist thinker who came up with ideas, enacted those ideas, worked at the local level, but is someone who paid the ultimate price. He was captured by the regime and ultimately martyred, and he leaves behind him a legacy. The local councils continue to proliferate, continue to do the important work, and I think studying this, remembering him, and holding his martyrdom close. He wasn't killed by the regime, he was martyred. And I think that's very important, because in the discourses of martyrdom, there are certain people who are allowed to be and certain who are just ignored. And I think, no, in order for it to actually make any sense for me, being killed by the Syrian regime for being a revolutionary is martyrdom. So basically what's going to happen in a few days is there's going to be several events and talks about Omar Aziz, about the Syrian revolution, obviously now in a slightly different light, with the fall of the Assad regime, with ultimately the successes of the Syrian revolution, which started with people like Aziz, which started with the local councils, and which exists not only as an oppositional thing to just overthrow Assad, that's the primary goal, but is to build a new society. The councils, I think, are really important. And same goes for mutual aid in general, not just as a mode of resistance, but as a mode of creating an alternative way of relating to one another, to organize as a society, to be in community. To me, it's like it provides a kind of path towards, yeah, you know what I mean? Like actual liberation in a sort of different conception of it, not as in just having a better leader. And this, to me, I saw this very clearly with the local councils and the resistance committees in Sudan, which I might do a whole episode about to like really dig deep into them. Maybe a video essay actually, because like, again, I'm constantly shocked how little attention there is paid to this, even though to me, these spell like the most amazing, incredible, powerful, politically potent forms of organizing anywhere in the world. I mean, I don't know everywhere in the world, but like these are huge. And it's being slept on, to use a Gen Z term. Omar Aziz was really important to me when I discovered him because I definitely had this path that I was going down wherein, I was kind of becoming a tanky, kind of becoming a bit alt-right, which honestly, I should talk about. I should fucking talk about, because those things are not mutually exclusive. And I think I have a very personal attachment to how that all worked. But essentially, I was thinking so much in a macro scale. I was only reading Noam Chomsky. I was only thinking in terms of the big picture, the Middle East, you know what I mean, as this big chessboard of different players and states act in their own interest. And I think things really shifted for me on October 17, 2019, with the sort of start of the Lebanese revolution, because to me, that was like the first expression in my life of literally rising up, but rather of like seeing my community, a feeling of my people, because for a moment there was like a struggle. They were all unified with the struggle against the sectarian oligarchy. And I, from that moment, really began to shift in my interest and my focus, and it ceased to be anything about these big names, specifically white men, and especially dead white men, and started to beat up, okay, where is the living? Who around me? Like I can quote Chomsky and Varoufakis and Zizek and all the kind of like classic contemporary leftist daddies, but I didn't know any Arab leftists. I knew some like older ones, but looking around, like who's producing the work now and who's not just writing but doing. And that's why anarchism for me is also really important in terms of like, it's not just a discourse. It's not just like, yes, I have a good analysis. It's like the manifesting of it on the ground, the working within your community, the kind of actually being politically engaged, or at least socially engaged. Which to me, that's like a big frustration and why I really just don't give a shit about most people who call themselves leftists, Marxists, or whatever. It's like, what are you doing? That was a big thing for me growing up. I would talk so much politics and constantly, like my parents would tell me, okay, cool, even if you're right, what are you doing? Like you talk a big game, but no. And again, October 17, even before it, but I was like, no, you know what? I will walk the walk and talk the talk, and then talk the walk and whatever. So Omar Aziz was just this person who, discovering him is also like, I felt so fucked up because I definitely, very initially in the Syrian revolution, I identified with it, I saw it, I recognized it. But I did very quickly fall into, or at least by 2013, 14, into some of these like narratives, which once emerging from them, I realized how violent it is, how much like literal erasure there are of Syrians. And so I felt really shit, like really, really, really shit, because it was like, I don't know, I didn't pay attention to people like Aziz while he was still alive. Same goes for someone like Sarah Hijazi. And then I constantly think to myself, who is alive now that I'm not paying attention to? Who are the voices that I want to be uplifting or at least listening to that I might not be already? And specifically those who are like facing extermination. Because every single breath they take, every little milliliter of piss that comes out of whatever has more worth than all of the mouth gargling garbage that comes out of half of these tankies, all these tankies' mouths. They don't know. The level of ignorance, the level of like narrative. I mean, it's all narrative, but like there's a very specific, despite everything, the level of delusion, the level of grifting and opportunism is beyond. And so I'm very happy that in a week there will be sort of like several commemorations of Omar Aziz. There's even a website of it. I'll post it in the links below. There's also a thing that's like a long PDF of a Syrian revolution reader. And yeah, basically check out the links, check out if there's anything happening in your area, check out if there's anything online, learn more about Omar Aziz, continue centering Arab voices, like frontline voices, again, not just Arabs, in any situation. Focus on the people who have most to lose, or who have most at stake, or who are most engaged. And yeah, stop reading about the Paris communes. Khalas, it's done. They're gone. Read about it, fine. But no, also read about the actual anarchist organizing that's happening at the moment, and engage before it's too late. So okay, I think that is an episode. Thank you all for joining. As always, if you like this podcast, there's the tip jar below. Leave comments, reviews, ratings, wherever you're listening to this podcast. Join the Patreon. You get access to exclusive content if you join the Patreon. Like my sub-series, Keep This Between Us, where I tell funny stories from my life, as well as other stuff. And yeah, ultimately, thank you for listening, and I hope to see you in the next one.